All right, come take a seat. Hi to folks joining us virtually. Thanks for being here. And welcome back after a 1 week hiatus away. Did you feel yourself last Tuesday like itching for some Talmud? You were. You felt it, yes. Or that was just your perm hangover, one of the two. You know, could have been one, could have been the other. Let's start with our blessing. La'asok b'divrei Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Thank you, God, for the opportunity to immerse deeply in words of Torah. Has anyone read or listened to the book by George Saunders, Lincoln in the Bardo? Okay, a few of you. I listened to it, which was actually a phenomenal experience because there are many characters in this book, and they're all played by different voice actors. It was really enjoyable listen. But the book, it was written in 2017. I think it won the Booker Prize. It's a kind of a magical realist book built on a kernel of historical truth, which is that in 1862, Abraham Lincoln's son, Willie, passed away. And there were newspaper, and this is mid-Civil War, right? And there were newspaper reports at the time that attested to the fact that President Lincoln visited the cemetery in DC where his son Willie was interred and would actually go into the crypt and hold his newly deceased son and spend time with him in that space. So that's the historical fact that the book is then built around. But then the book takes a phenomenal and fantastical turn. Lincoln in the Bardo. Bardo being a term I associate primarily with Tibetan Buddhism to describe an intermediate stage between death and whatever comes after death. And the story unfolds with the sort of souls and ghosts that are similarly buried or located in this cemetery, conversing with one another, observing Lincoln coming into their space, observing the new arrival, Willie Lincoln. And as a whole, it's a book which kind of contains its own meditations on death and grief and what happens after we die. And so I'm actually opening our learning today with two quotes from Lincoln in the Bardo. So these are the first two sources on your page written in italics. When the man, that would be President Lincoln, entered with the boy, Willie, in his arms, a change came over the place. All of us felt it. Something in the air trembled. A warmth passed through the yard, and we knew that one of the living had come among us. So the us, right, is this collection of deceased souls that are conversing, I would say loudly and crudely and comically and poignantly in the cemetery. And then the second quote, we assembled in small knots, whispering about our former lives. Some remembered their misdeeds, some their triumphs. We debated, we argued, we laughed when the memory allowed it, but always we were together, bound by the strange circumstance of our continued existence. All right, it's worth saying at the beginning of this class that ours is a religion primarily focused on this world and what we do with our limited time here on this planet. But that fact, what I just said, is sometimes misrepresented as a notion that Judaism doesn't believe in an afterlife. Right? Maybe you've heard that. Have you heard that growing up or heard that in Jewish spaces? You know, Jews don't believe in heaven, or Jews don't believe in hell, or we believe in heaven but not hell, or some combination thereof. The other misconception is that Jewish texts don't address these questions, right? That Jewish texts don't examine the question of what happens after we die, and neither of those are true. Jewish texts both have what to say about afterlife and answer affirmatively, have a number of affirmative answers about afterlife. So while it's true that there are a wide range of perspectives on what happens after we die. It's also true, and I think where the misrepresentation comes from is that we don't have a dogmatic conclusion about which one of these opinions is the official stance, right? This definitively is what Judaism says happens after we die, and none of the other ideas are correct. That is what Judaism does not offer. What we're left with is a kind of buffet of opinions about what happens after we die, and ultimately the humility that no one really knows, right? What, if any, is the truth of it all? The other thing I want to say before we really dive into our text today is that, in the post-Enlightenment world, where rationalism reigns supreme, the predominant perspective is that consciousness is linked to an embodied existence. Right? Our consciousness is more or less a function of our brains. And so when our brains cease to work, or our bodies cease to work, our consciousness departs. Right? That's the prevailing notion, I would say, in a rationalist world. That does not seem to be the majority view in rabbinic sources. And so, in the spirit of this class, right, learning for the sake of learning, I want to ask us to try, at least for the next 52 minutes, to inhabit the humility and the sense of mystery that accompanies this topic, right? That maybe rationalism presents one idea of what happens with our consciousness after we die, but maybe there are other ideas out there, right? Let's see what else is on the buffet and maybe try to sample something new today that we wouldn't normally pick, and that we might end up saying, I don't want a second helping of that. But let's take a look, right? Let's take a look at what the rabbis have to say about this question of consciousness. I always feel in sort of the world post-COVID that any mention of buffets just gives like a little shiver down my spine. Like, I'm not sure I've eaten at a buffet since then, but I guess other than the every Shabbat morning at IKAR, it was just a kind of buffet. Okay, all right. So I have, as you can see, Browsian aspirations for how much text we're going to cover today. I have a lot of text. The first half of them are really kind of to help us establish the background in order to then dive more deeply into three fascinating kind of graveyard cemetery ghost stories. But I think the first couple of texts I'm going to move through quickly because they just sort of help us establish the broad overview of the rabbinic perspective on this topic. All right, first text is from Vayikra Rabbah, Leviticus Rabbah. Rabbi Abba, son of Rav Papi and Rabbi Yoshua of Sichnin, in the name of Rabbi Levi, said, for the first 3 days after death, the soul hovers over the body, thinking that it will return to it. When it sees that its appearance has changed, it departs. I'm hearing a couple of which I really like. I want to hear more about that in a second. Let's just make sure we understand what's happening in this text, right? We tend to think of death as a fixed, concrete moment in time. It is very clear when we've shifted in the binary from life to death. But for the rabbis, the soul, at the very least, doesn't experience it this way. There's a kind of confusion that the soul experiences about where to go once the breath of life departs. And it's the visual cue of the initial stages of the decomposition of the body that signals to the soul, I guess my time in this body is up, time to go elsewhere. Right? But there's a kind of a liminality being expressed and articulated here, right? Interestingly, we sometimes speak of the liminal period as the time between death and burial. We actually, the rabbis have a term for it. It's called aninut, as opposed to avelut. Avelut is the beginning of the 12-month year of mourning. Aninut is the time between the death of a loved one and the burial. And there's a sense that, you're neither here nor there. And by the way, I think that very much speaks to the psychological and emotional reality that many people experience before either a burial or a memorial service, where you feel a little bit like your grief is a bit suspended, like you haven't. It's like a yellow light. You're waiting for the green light to be able to fully begin grieving. There seems to be something almost mirrored in the experience of the soul itself, or mirrored for the experience of the deceased, that there's this kind of liminality in the first few days after death, right? Death has definitely happened, but the soul has some confusion about that. And I will just say, and I want to be careful here because I'm wading into now a topic that I really don't know enough about to be speaking extensively about. But I have to wonder to what degree the Gospels, right, which emerge in the context of Rabbinic Judaism, are thinking about a source like this when they frame Jesus's time in the cave as a 3-day period before he emerges and a new life begins. If there's some kind of parallel here that 3 days is enough for a death to be confirmed, enough for the soul to depart, and then the transformative act of resurrection can happen in the Christian context. I'll just put it out there for those who might know more about this topic. So I see a couple of hands. Let's hear from Rabbi Zaki and Jeff. And then, as I said, we're kind of speeding through these sources to get to the stories. All right. Good. Yes. Good. So Rabbi Zaki said that this text reminds her of the importance of the Chevra Kadisha, of which IKAR has one. That is the group that really takes care of the needs of the deceased in that liminal period that I was describing between the death of a loved one and the burial. And the two traditional acts are Shmirah, the guarding of the body, which is both a spiritual guarding and a physical guarding. We don't think of it so much today, thank God, because the bodies of the deceased are safer today than they were 1,500 years ago, when there was real danger of the body being defiled or stolen or something like that. And then the other function is tahara, which is the washing and preparing and dressing of the body for burial. Yeah. Jeff?
Yeah. So, at what point did the minhag, the custom of Jewish burial within 24, 48 hours, come in light of this?
Okay. So expedient Jewish burial has been the custom since the beginning. However, in-ground burial is likely not what the rabbis in this text or in any of the texts that we're going to read today are imagining. What burial used to look like was that there were caves and there were sort of like holes that were dug out of the walls of caves, and the body was placed into, and this is, by the way, speaking of the Gospels, right? This is also in the Jesus story, and the patriarchs, right? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the matriarchs are buried in Ma'arat HaMachpelah, right? They are buried in a cave. And so likely what happened was there was 2 stages of burial. The first stage was that you would put the body into the cave. The body would decompose. People would visit that cave and really witness the ongoing decomposition of the body. And then the rabbis understood that at around the 12-month mark, the body was sufficiently decomposed that you could then take the bones of the deceased out of the specific cubicle, for lack of a better word, where the body was initially buried, and then place those bones with other families members' bones, which is why in the Bible, I believe the Hebrew is Vaye'asef el Amav. When it talks about our patriarchs being buried, it says, and ultimately they will be gathered to their kin. And what that likely refers to is the second stage of burial, where the bones are taken and then placed in sort of the family crypt, right? Placed with the bones of other family members. So I don't know the answer to when in-ground burial became the predominant practice as opposed to this cave burial. But everything that we're reading today assumes cave burial. Okay, let's continue. Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, the second text. All the 7 days of mourning, the soul goes forth and returns from its former home to its supernal abode, and from its supernal abode to its former home. After the 7 days of mourning, the body begins to breed worms, and it decays and returns to the dust as it originally was, as it is said, and the dust returns to the earth as it was. The soul goes forth and returns to the place whence it was given from heaven, as it is said, and the soul returns unto God who gave it. So again, there might be some you might ask, how do these texts sit alongside each other? Is it a 3-day process? Is it a 7-day process? As you're about to see, is it a 12-month process? What I want you to learn and just take away from these texts is that there's a kind of a soul journey happening that is gradual and in stages, and the stages mirror the stages of mourning that we observe. So 7 days of the soul going back and forth from somewhere around the body to its ultimate resting place, right? The supernal abode. There are texts that say that our souls are installed under the divine throne of glory, right? Or in some other reality, that the soul is bouncing forth between realities, between heaven and earth, for the full 7 days of Shiva. Which again, is just, there's something poignant and poetic about thinking about the mirroring, right? Like, here we are in our homes, traditionally not leaving our homes, while the soul is bouncing back and forth between heaven and earth. Right? Both living and deceased are in this liminal space. Let's look at the next text. I maybe should have given you a warning this close to breakfast, how much maggot and worm decomposition we would be learning, but here we go. Rabbi Yitzchak said, the maggots that eat the flesh of the deceased are as painful to the dead as a needle in the flesh of the living. As it says with regard to the dead, but his flesh is in pain for him, and his soul mourns over him. I want to pause for a moment, because we've just been introduced to a new idea. Namely, the soul feels pain. I understand this metaphor or this analogy, right, as a needle in the flesh of the living to mean pain. Right? This isn't like when you tell your kids when they're about to get a shot at the pediatrician's office, oh, it's just like a little prick. I think this is, and you're lying to them, right? I'm lying to them, right? This is painful. So the process of decomposition of the body is somehow painful to the soul. The soul which is hovering above the body, the soul which is moving back and forth between the body. If you're looking for a rationalist explanation, I refer you back to my comment 15 minutes ago. Just hold the mystery of what's happening here. Right? But that is being established by this text, that there is some kind of soul pain that happens. I don't know. Is it somatic? I don't know, because I don't know precisely what it means for a soul to feel pain in its disembodied form, triggered by an embodied process. But that is what's being described here. Go ahead, Lisa.
I have this picture of the soul as being very pure and innocent, but also very confused about what's happened.
Yeah.
And you don't want to disrespect it. that will deepen its confusion. We just want to console the soul.
Yeah, right. So Lisa is saying that there's this idea that the soul is in a kind of state of confusion. I mean, it gives a new meaning to the term "a lost soul," right? But that does seem to be what's happening here. The soul is not sure where it's supposed to be, and it's in a profoundly vulnerable state. And so that there's some sense that the way that we interact with that soul ought to be respectful of the arduous and confusing and new journey that it's on. And that's also mirrored in the practices of the Chevra Kadisha. But it seems that there are both sort of emotional, spiritual, and physical needs or that the soul has in this moment. Okay, let's go on. Rav Chisda said, a person's soul mourns for him during all 7 days of mourning following his death. Just think about that. The soul is mourning for its own previous form of existence, right? The soul is mourning over the deceased body, right? The soul is saying to some degree, what a life I had in that individual. I'm going to miss them. I'm going to miss the ways that they took me around here and there and the ways they put me into relationship with this person and with that person. There's a kind of a longing that the soul feels having departed the body, which then which generates a need for mourning. The soul is mourning over its own body. Again, for what length of time? Right, for the period of Shiva. Rav Yehuda said, in the case of a deceased person who has no comforters, i.e., he has nobody to mourn for him, right? So a deceased person who has, traditionally what this would mean is no immediate family for whom the obligations of Avelut would fall. So no spouse, no parent, no child, no siblings. What happens? 10 people should go and sit in his place and accept condolences. The Gemara relates the story of a certain person who died in Rav Yehuda's neighborhood who did not have any comforters. Every day of Shiva, Rav Yehuda would take 10 people and they would sit in his place in the house of the deceased. After 7 days had passed, the deceased appeared to Rav Yehuda in his dream and said to him, "Put your mind to rest, for you have put my mind to rest." All right, I love this picture because it's highlighting for us a kind of a dual function of Shiva. We tend, as predominantly rationalists, and I'm not trying to dismiss or cast aspersions on this belief system, right? But I have said to many people, as a word of pastoral counseling, Shiva is for the mourners, right? Shiva is for you. Let's think about how to create a space in which you will receive the consolation and the presence of your community as needed. The Gemara accepts that as one function of Shiva, so much so that even if there are no immediate mourners, you assemble a group of 10 mourners to receive words of consolation. But that's not where the function of Shiva ends. The function of Shiva is also to provide consolation for the soul of the deceased. That's remarkable and unusual, right? Melissa?
It's even unsettling.
Yes.
I feel like the whole thing when someone's in pain and they're suffering, it's like the minute they die, you're like, oh, at least their pain and suffering is over. And now you're saying, what about not?
Right.
You have 7 more days to endure.
Oh. Right, and what we might see is that it might be 12 months, right? So yes, so Melissa said that there's something unsettling, and I completely agree about these texts, because sometimes there's a kind of comfort in knowing that our loved one is no longer in the pain that they were in their final days of suffering. And these texts seem to indicate that there is a suffering, or at the very least, a grief, and maybe it's the distinction there that can help us sit with this text more comfortably, that the soul of the deceased continues to experience even beyond the moment of death. And yeah, there's something unsettling about that.
Sorry, especially I guess it could be comforting if it's a sudden death.
Yeah.
Because they didn't have time to move.
Right.
So maybe that's their time.
Right. So if maybe if it's a sudden death, Melissa is saying that there's something comforting because then it creates time for the soul to I don't want to say come to terms, but to adjust and experience the waves of emotions that accompany that moment, and perhaps the suffering that or the grief that the soul experiences is kind of categorically different than what the soul was experiencing while still embodied. Maybe it is a kind of suffering or a kind of grief that's hard for us to understand because it belongs to a different realm. Maybe it's a different nature of suffering. A couple things to point out, and then I see your hand, Jill. Right, so these texts seem to indicate the deceased can experience pain. The soul mourns for the deceased. The soul needs comfort. Shiva is for the mourners and for the deceased. And then the last line of this text then introduces another new idea, right? What happens in the dream? The soul of the deceased communicates with Rav Yehuda. So that introduces a whole new idea, which we're then going to explore in the stories that follow, which is that communication is possible between realms. Right? And in this case, the communication that happens is reassuring to the mourners. Right? And what a gift that is, right? To feel like you receive a message from behind the veil, a message from a different realm that signals to us, and this is to Melissa's earlier point, right, that the distress that soul might have been in, maybe in the act of dying, maybe in the time since their death, is now found equilibrium, right? So that we're not stuck in that fear or uncertainty that Melissa mentioned permanently. Go ahead, Jill.
I have a great teacher, Rabbi Panitz, and a couple of years ago we were talking about the Tibetan Book of the Dead and how with the mourners they have photos of the deceased there, and after a certain period of mourning, the family burns the photos to signal to the person it's time to move out of the Bardo. And you reminded me that the reason we do Kaddish for a year is to gently nudge the soul to like remind them this is for them, and it gives them like that year to kind of move if let's say they had a sudden death or they're still very attached to the earth realm. Which that's my other question is just sort of like, are there people who have been dying for a while who have really released, and when they leave the body they're like ready to go, and there are other ones who are like more attached to the earth plane that stick around more? Is there, or does everybody stick around in that way? So those are my two things.
Well, he sounds great. And the simple answer is I don't know. But let's read the next text because it brings us into the 12 months and it connects exactly to what you just said about the Kaddish and the 12-month period of Kaddish. So this is from the Bavli, and then Jill, if I don't come close to trying to answer your question, then ask it again. For a full 12 months, a deceased person's body remains, and his soul ascends and descends, such that it is sometimes in this world with its body. After 12 months, the body ceases to exist, and his soul ascends to its place beneath the throne of glory and does not descend anymore. So the idea here is that there is a 12-month period in which the soul is making its complete journey to its ultimate resting place, right, beneath the throne of glory, and that it's not a linear trajectory. It's kind of like back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And maybe to your point, Jill, right? Some souls are doing more of that back and forth, and some souls understand from an earlier stage in the process what the ultimate destination is. But the idea that Jill mentioned, that the mourner's Kaddish has a role to play, is one of the traditional explanations of the mourner's Kaddish. Again, like I said about Shiva, right? That it's not just a place for the mourner to thrice daily check in with their own grief and be brought into memory and relationship with their loved one who passed, but it's also, in a kind of a mystical sense, in service of the soul of the deceased itself. That the souls of the deceased are in need of some kind of assistance from below to reach their ultimate destination. And so Kaddish Yatom, mourner's Kaddish, is a kind of a tailwind. Like we are producing a tailwind that helps guide the soul in the direction it needs to be going. Which I love that notion because, right, it keeps the relationship active and reciprocal, and it also helps me feel like there's something I can do to still love and be of service to deceased loved ones, to the souls of deceased loved ones. Malik.
Richard asked, but today there's a 12-month mourning period, actually 11 months for parents, but only 30 days for siblings, spouses, and children, correct?
That is correct. That is the sort of traditional breakdown. And I don't know how that breakdown then aligns with a text like this, to be perfectly honest. Right? And I will say, I think at IKAR, we tend to encourage a full 12-month mourning period for any loved one, instead of making the distinctions between parent and other kind of immediate relatives. I think primarily because of psychological, emotional reasons, but perhaps this is an additional reason as well. Okay. All right, we did okay in terms of time. So we now have 25 minutes to work through a fair amount of text, but these are 3 different stories that are now going to explore the question of what consciousness is retained by the souls of the deceased, right? Are they like the spirits in Lincoln and the Bardo chatting away? Are they aware of what's happening here on Earth? Can we communicate with them? Can they communicate with us? And we're going to see 3 different stories exploring those questions. Okay? Here we go. The Gemara relates that Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Yonatan were walking in a cemetery, and the sky blue string of Rabbi Yonatan's ritual fringes, his tzitzit, was cast to the ground and dragging across the graves. What an image. What a great image. I mean, if you were writing a short story, nice way to start the short story. His strand of techelet, right, that blue fringe that you sometimes see attached to the tzitzit, is dragging along the graves as these 2 rabbis are immersed in conversation. Rabbi Chia said to him, "Lift it, so the dead will not say, tomorrow when their day comes, they will come to be buried with us, and now they are insulting us." Rabbi Yonatan said to him, "Do the dead know so much? Isn't it stated, and the dead know nothing?" From Ecclesiastes. Rabbi Chia said to him, "If you read the verse, you did not read it a second time, and if you read it a second time, you did not read it a third time, and if you read it a third time, they did not explain it to you properly." It's a great rabbinic insult. "For the living know that they will die. These are the righteous, who even in their death are called living." Okay, a couple things happening in this text. Rabbi Chia is aware of the fact, or believes, that the dead in this cemetery are aware of what's happening, have the kind of consciousness that is so attuned to the unfolding of the reality in the cemetery that they will see and be offended by the string dragging along their graves, that they'll interpret it as a kind of taunting. Now, I should just say, because we talked about Chevra Kadisha earlier, For those who wore a talit in life, it is traditional to put a talit over the body of the deceased in the casket. But you don't put the talit as is. You cut one of the fringes of the talit to make it a ritually, like a treif, to make it a non-kosher talis, as if to say, we don't expect this talit to be used for the performance of mitzvot because the dead can no longer perform mitzvot. And so it's actually considered an act of chesed, an act of kind of mercy and loving kindness to the deceased to cut the fringe as if to say, we know that you are not able to perform mitzvot anymore, and so we're going to make this tzitzit, this talit, ineligible for mitzvah use. Okay, so Rabbi Chia is aware, is sort of claiming here that the dead are aware of what's happening, would feel a kind of a longing for the performance of mitzvot, and then would be offended of this kind of disregard for the tzitzit that's happening in the cemetery. And when Rabbi Yonatan says, what are you talking about? These dead are dead. They have no idea what's happening. And here's a relatively straightforward proof text. The dead know nothing. Rabbi Chia says, you don't understand what that text is actually saying. And then this, I think, is one of the sort of pivotal reinterpretation that then operates in all of these stories. Even in their death are called living. There's a kind of life that happens for the dead. Yes?
Is any of this canceled if you're cremated?
Okay. Is any of this canceled if you are cremated? In my opinion, no. Will you find rabbis who say yes? You will. I firmly believe that while the tradition understands the interaction between earth and body as being a source of comfort and integral to the process of the soul's departure, I don't think that in the absence of burial, the soul is somehow trapped and unable to make its journey. So I think that no matter how burial happens, whether that's cremation or burial, or God forbid, a body is lost at sea, right? Or we could come up with different other scenarios, that the soul goes on this journey regardless, and we're able to interact with the soul regardless. We should have another longer conversation about burial and cremation, but maybe not for today. Okay, is it okay if I? Okay, all right. So even in their death, they're called living. So let's move on to source number 6. This is like really like, ghost stories from the Talmud. This one really digs in even further. By the way, these are all, you can see, from Brachot 18, either A or B. So these stories are pretty much consecutive with one another. I skip a couple of lines just because it's less narrative and it's more rabbis arguing about what a particular verse means or doesn't mean. So I wanted to take you into the stories themselves. All right, here we go. There was an incident involving a pious man who gave a poor man a dinar, that's an amount of money, on the eve of Rosh Hashanah during drought years, and his wife mocked him for giving so large a sum at such a difficult time. And in order to escape her incessant mockery, he went and slept in the cemetery. I mean, just aside from this being kind of like casually misogynist, this is sort of like a whole new doghouse. Like, he didn't go sleep on the couch. He went and slept in the cemetery. Okay, so what happened there? He heard 2 spirits conversing with each other. One said to the other, "My friend, let us roam the world and hear from behind the heavenly curtain what calamity will befall the world." The other spirit said to her, "I cannot go with you, as I'm buried in a mat of reeds. But you go and tell me what you hear." She went and roamed and came back. The other spirit said, "My friend, what did you hear from behind the heavenly curtain?" She replied, "I heard that anyone who sows during the first rainy season of this year, hail will fall and strike his crops." Hearing this is like insider trading, right? Hearing this, the pious man went and sowed his seeds during the second rainy season. Ultimately, the crops of the entire world were stricken by hail, and his crops were not stricken. Okay, let's just make sure we understand what's happening in this, delightful campfire ghost story. He goes and sleeps in the cemetery, and what do you know? The souls are having a lively conversation, and they're sort of interested in some playful mischief, right? Let's sort of leave the cemetery. Let's go roaming. Let's try to go maybe somewhere where we can hear some exclusive or private heavenly information. And they have a kind of a nefarious intention, right? Let's see what calamity will befall the world this year. Won't that be fun, right? The souls say. And then we're introduced to this kind of strange quirk in the text, which is that one soul is able to go on the journey and the other soul is not. The soul that is buried in a mat of reeds. So I'm not entirely clear what's going on here. It seems to be, right, the traditional burial garment is linens, right? So for someone to be buried in a mat of reeds as opposed to linens can either signal poverty, right? That somehow the loved ones of this deceased soul didn't have the financial resources necessary to do a proper burial, to bury this daughter in linen shrouds. Or it could be for some reason other than poverty. It was they forsook a dignified burial and did an improper burial of sorts. What we are left to understand, though, is that something about the sort of physicality of burial does act as a constraint on the movement of this soul. Why, we're not exactly sure, but that seems to be sort of stated as a given in the text.
It seems like a proof text for why we have to follow the rituals.
Yes. Right, that's right. So yeah, I mean, Melissa said it seems like a proof text for following the rituals. So then maybe there's a side agenda, right, in the rabbis are articulating here, which is, and this perhaps is linked to the less permissive rabbinic opinion about cremation, right? That if you don't proceed with the burial rituals as they are technically formulated, there are eternal consequences for the soul of your loved one. So I'm sort of cautious with that, embracing that perspective because of the implications and where it can take us vis-a-vis the conversation about cremation. But yeah, it does seem to be part of what's being expressed here. Yeah, Janet.
Or is it possible that when you mock your spouse, you have a nightmare and you will not be buried in the right linens because he gave away all the money?
So Janet is saying that. Are you saying that this whole thing is a nightmare and that he is imagining that I better get in right relationship with my wife or else I might end up like the soul who's buried in a mat of reeds as opposed to the soul who was buried in linen shrouds?
That's possible. I'm just saying your subconscious solves problems for you when you're sleeping.
Yeah.
And maybe he was concerned about it.
Okay. He clearly has a lot to work out, both with his wife and in his own psyche. But yes, yeah, Marshall.
I don't know. There's the equivalent of anthropomorphizing, which would be kind of projecting onto the souls our own perspective. I find myself thinking about the mat of reeds is in a way between slavery and freedom because of crossing the sea of reeds.
Wow. Beautiful. Beautiful, right? So the mat of reeds for Marshall makes the linguistic association with Yam Suf, right? The Sea of Reeds, which is its own liminal place between slavery and liberation, just like these burial garb becomes a kind of a liminal place between freedom of movement for the soul, liberation for the soul, or a kind of perpetual enslavement of the soul. Beautiful. All right, I'm gonna move us on because there's even one more story, and we haven't even finished this story. The soul, just to say it once more, right? The soul here goes on some journey, sort of behind the veil, and learns what the meteorological prediction or future will be, and then the man, having overheard that, follows the advice. Well, it wasn't advice, but right, he charts out his planting season according to what he just heard, and he was wise to do so, right? Because his crop was spared, because he knew from this overheard conversation not to plant in the first rainy season. The following year, on the eve of Rosh Hashanah, the same pious man went and slept in the cemetery at his own initiative. No fight this time. He just knows, like, this is the time to overhear souls speaking. And again, he heard the two spirits conversing with each other. One said to the other, "Let us roam the world and hear from behind the heavenly curtain what calamity will befall the world." She said to her, "My friend, have I not already told you that I cannot, as I am buried in a mat of reeds? Rather, you go and tell me what you hear." She went and roamed and returned. The other spirit said to her, "My friend, what did you hear from behind the curtain?" She said to her, "I heard that those who sow during the second rainy season, blight will strike his crop. That pious man went and sowed during the first rainy season. Since everyone else sowed during the second rainy season, ultimately the crops of the entire world were blighted, and his crops were not blighted." Okay, so very similar setup, right? He overhears basically the same conversation, except the advice is flipped, right? This time the calamity will strike in a different rainy season, right? And it'll be blight instead of hail. And so the whole world thinks, last year we remember what happened, let's correct for that mistake. And they correct, but to no avail. Whereas just this man does the reverse, and once again, his crop is the one that's spared. The pious man's wife said to him, she's on to him, "Why is it that last year the crops of the entire world were stricken and yours were not stricken? And now, this year, the crops of the entire world were blighted and yours were not blighted?" Like, what gives? You're not that smart. What's happening here? He related to her the entire story. The rabbis said, "It was not even a few days later that a quarrel fell between the pious man's wife and the mother of the young woman who was buried there. The pious man's wife said to her scornfully, 'Go, and I will show you your daughter, and you will see that she is buried in a mat of reeds.' The following year, he again went and slept in the cemetery and heard the same spirits conversing with each other. One said to the other, 'My friend, let us roam the world and hear from behind the heavenly curtain what calamity will befall the world.' She said to her, 'My friend, leave me alone, as words that we have privately exchanged between us have already been heard among the living. Apparently, the dead know what transpires in this world.'" And I'll just read the last line. The Gemara responds, "This is no proof. Perhaps another person who heard about the conversation of the spirits secondhand died, and he went and told them that they had been overheard." Okay, that last part is just to say that following each story, there's a debate. Does this prove that the souls of the deceased are actually conscious and aware of what's happening in the living, in the world of the living? And each time some rabbis say yes, and some rabbis say no. So what that little line there is just kind of an immediate rebuttal, and I almost didn't include it because it kind of distracts from the story, but I wanted you to see it because of one of the ways that I started this class, which is there is nonetheless this kind of humility or uncertainty or a buffet of options about what do the souls of the deceased actually know, right? To what degree are they conscious? But if we can put that aside, there's something really interesting happening before that line. right? So the wife uses this privileged information, gets into an argument with the mother of the girl who is buried in the mat of reeds, and uses that fact against her to diss her, right? And it's interesting. Does the mother not know how her daughter is buried, or does she think that that's confidential information? And right, there's no way that this wife of the pious man should know this. And upon saying that to her, the souls of the deceased become sort of newly aware of what's happening in the land of the living, and then realize they have to be more careful about what they're saying because they're being listened to. What's going on?
They're only being listened to by people who sleep in the cemetery.
True. So Janet says they're only being listened to by people who sleep in the cemetery, or at least this one guy who sleeps in the cemetery. But that's enough for them, at least in this moment, right, to pull back. But it's interesting how they say it, right? They don't say words that have been privately exchanged, have already been heard among the living. They don't say, this guy who's here already is eavesdropping on us, wait till he leaves. There seems to be we got to be careful here with the kind of communication that's happening in our realm, because there's a kind of eavesdropping that isn't good. It isn't good for the world. Jill, yeah.
I think about I can't remember what it is, but I think it's always happening. It says when you see a sorceress, kill her. And so there's an idea that this is a cautionary tale that this may or may not have happened, but that they're saying medium communication between the worlds is not something that you should do.
Okay, good. So I think the question is, right, I think it's fair to say that the rabbis are not denying the possibility or reality of communication between the worlds, right? I think they seem to imply very strongly that it is quite possible, right? That the dead are aware of what's happening in the land of the living. They have some sort of divination abilities to sort of overhear or predict what's going to happen in the future. They are able to freely discuss it amongst themselves. The living are able, or at least the pious, are able to overhear and comprehend and benefit from that. And so then the question is sort of to what ends and what are the risks of that? And how do the risks of that dynamic impact what ought to be the interactions between the dead and the living? Right? It doesn't go as far as to say that the living should not try to inquire what the dead are saying, but when they use the conversation for cruel ends, right, what's being used, they don't object to his benefiting agriculturally, right? They object to the use of something from their realm that then makes someone who's living feel dissed, feel less than, feel criticized, right? And that is the line. That's where they draw the line. That's where they say, oh, zip, Mary.
Two things. One, would it have been different if had he learned that and told his other farmers, hey guys, at least they had it. And then also, we read earlier that at 12 months the souls are gone, but this is after 2 years.
Yep. So I guess we don't exactly know where these souls are that are having the conversation. I mean, there's somehow, you're able to overhear them in the cemetery. What we learned about the 12 months is that they're going back and forth. So you're right. I mean, are they installed under the throne of glory and having the conversation? It sure seems more like they're somehow still hovering above the body, which is housed in the cemetery. So you're right. May that be the biggest contradiction in these texts, but there seems to be some contradiction between what we read about the 12 months and where the souls seem to be located here. But Mary, to your earlier point, right, there's more to object to here, right? It's not just the use of the privileged information to embarrass someone, right? It's also maybe we're left with a little bit of a sour taste in our mouth about how this man used the information exclusively for personal benefit, where he could have, although why didn't he, right? Is there some line being drawn here about what the living ought to know about the realm of the deceased, right? There's a difference between what they can know and what they ought to know, and then if what they know gets instrumentalized into some reality that overly collapses the difference between the worlds, then it's a problem. So maybe there's multiple problems going on here. Rabbi Zaki and then Lisa. And we will not do the last text, even though it's so good. We're not going to do the last text. We're not going to do it.
Let's do it.
Go ahead, Rabbi Zaki. Yeah? Okay. Yeah.
More than a year past, and then if I pay attention, I'm receiving some really wise wisdom.
Yeah. Absolutely, right? So what is the wisdom that we receive, right, from our deceased loved ones? Is that a form of soul communication? And often it does happen in the form of dreams. Quickly, yeah.
I mentioned that the woman being dissed is the real harm, but I don't think that's the real harm. To me, it's the relationship between the mother and the deceased daughter and the mother's memory of the deceased daughter.
Beautifully said. Okay, all right, with your permission, we are going to go a little bit over, but we're going to do the last text. Okay, come in here. They would deposit the money of orphans with Shmuel's father for safekeeping. When Shmuel's father died, Shmuel was not with him and did not learn from him the location of the money. Since he did not return it, Shmuel was called, son of him who consumes the money of orphans. Sometimes the Talmud just writes in the least clear way, right? Meaning Shmuel's dad dies. He had some relationship with orphans where he would safekeep their money. When he died, his son didn't know the location of where that money was kept. And so the orphans come to Shmuel and say, where did your father keep the money, right? We need to get the money back. Shmuel went after his father to the cemetery and said to the dead. Okay, so Shmuel goes to where his father is buried, to the cemetery, and says what I think is one of the most poignant lines in all of Gemara, I want Abba. The dead said to him, there are many Abbas here. He told them, I want Abba bar Abba, Abba son of Abba. Right? I want dad, grandpa's son. They said to him, there are also many people named Abba bar Abba here. He told them, I want Abba bar Abba, the father of Shmuel. Where is he? They replied, ascend to the yeshiva on high. So I just want to pause to sort of just feel it feels like that's written by someone who knows grief, who misses their parent, right? Just, I want Abba. You go to the cemetery and is he screaming it? Is he whispering it? Is he saying it over and over again? You can feel the longing in those words. And there's even a kind of there's an empathy that I hear in the response. There are a lot of Abbas here. You're not alone. A lot of us miss our Abba. Okay. So where does he go to find him, right? He needs to get this privileged, confidential information from his father, right? Where's the money kept? I need to return it to these orphans. So go to the yeshiva on high. One of the rabbinic images of what we would call heaven, this is so rabbinic, is where do rabbis go when they die? Yeshiva. They go to the place where they can study Torah all day and argue with each other all day about what Torah means. Go find him there. Meanwhile, right, on his way to the yeshiva on high, he saw his friend Levi, who is deceased, sitting outside the yeshiva, away from the rest of the deceased. He asked him, why do you sit outside? Why did you not ascend to the yeshiva? Levi replied, because they tell me that for all those years that you Levi, didn't enter the yeshiva of Rabbi Afas and thereby upset him, we will not grant you entry to the yeshiva on high. His deceased friend is being punished for something that for cutting class, right? For something that he did here on earth, right? He didn't go to a particular person's yeshiva, and the consequence of that is that in his afterlife, he's being kept out of the supernal yeshiva. He's right outside the doors. How agonizing is that? I mean, if the supreme reward in the rabbinic imagination is yeshiva on high, a supreme punishment is just outside the doors of the yeshiva, right? Unable to hear what's happening on the inside. Meanwhile, Shmuel's father came, right? So this is the deceased father that Shmuel is looking for. And Shmuel saw that he was crying and laughing. Shmuel said to his father, this is conversation between the living and the deceased, "Why are you crying?" His father replied, "Because you will come here soon." Shmuel continued and asked, "Why are you laughing?" His father replied, "Because you are extremely important in this world." Shmuel said to him, to his deceased father's soul, "If I am important, then let them grant Levi entry to the yeshiva." And so it was that they granted Levi entry to the yeshiva. Shmuel said to his father, right, he didn't forget his mission, "Where is the orphan's money?" He said to him, "Go and retrieve it from the mill house, where you will find the uppermost and the lowermost money is ours, and the money in the middle belongs to the orphans." Okay, because we are short on time, I'm just going to give my understanding of this text, although afterwards I want to hear yours. I think this is a gorgeous, gorgeous text. Okay, so first of all, Shmuel's son is motivated by the good in both worlds, right? He goes to find his father because he's on a mission to help find the money that belongs to these orphans that otherwise they would not have, and think about how much more vulnerable they would be, right? That's why he crosses the divide. He crosses the divide to try to access what is really privileged information in order to do good in this world. And then while he's there, he realizes he also has an opportunity to do good in that world. If I'm so important down here, right, he doesn't say, "Then let me live longer. Stop crying, Abba. Use your power to influence the divine spheres and give me a longer life." He doesn't even respond to his father's tears about, "You'll join me here soon." Right? What he responds to is this experience of ostracization, isolation that his friend is experiencing in the world to come. Right? That his friend is a soul excluded from the yeshiva on high. If I'm so important, please use this merit to give Levi a place in the yeshiva. Right? Shmuel can impact what's happening in the yeshiva shalmala, in the yeshiva on high, and he can impact what happens down below. And maybe that, right, that's the model as opposed to what we just saw in the cemetery agricultural scene. Right? The kind of communication that we aspire to is communication that can both positively impact this world and somehow benefit and do good in the soul, in the realm of heaven, in the soul's realm. Right? And that mirrors this dual function of Shiva, or the 12 months that we described earlier, as being both about the needs of the mourners and the needs of the souls of the deceased. I'll pause here for today. Shkoach, Shkoach. Thank you all so much. We'll conclude as we have with Kaddish de Rabbanan. If anyone is in a period of mourning, I'll invite you to rise. And today of all days, we'll do so with both our own hearts and souls in mind, and the souls of our deceased loved ones in mind as well. About your mom, Lois. יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה. בעלמא דברח חירותי וימליך מלכותי, בחייכון וביומייכון ובחיי דכל בית ישראל, בעגלה ובזמן קריב וימרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מבורך לעולם עולמי עולמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא. ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי דקודשה בריחו. לעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה, תושבחתה ונחמתה, דאמירן בעלמא וימרו אמן. על ישראל ועל רבנן ועל תלמידי הון, ועל כל תלמידי הון, ועל כל מן דעסקין באורייתא די ויתרא הדין ודי בכל אתר ואתר. יהי להון ולכון שלום רבה חינה וחיסתא ורחמין, וחיין אריכין ומזונה רוויחה, ופורקנה מן קדם ובהון דבשמיא וימרו אמן. יהי שלום רבה מן שמיא, וחיים טובים עלינו ועל כל ישראל וימרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל. Amen. Amen. Thank you all so much. Boker Tov.